Namaste, welcome to the Atharva Forum. We have with us Dr. Meenakshi Jain, lately with the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, so she's still a fellow there. And we're going to talk to her about her work on the wave of iconoclasm that has gone over India, starting with her latest book, which is about Mathura. You see, we've had decades of scholarly debate about Ayodhya, whereas there's hardly been any talk about Mathura, and indeed it doesn't lend itself very much to a debate. At least laymen will notice that it's an open and shut case. Best known temple destroyers, Mahmud Ghaznavi and Aurangzeb, both have been active there, have been doing their thing there. And they've been very open about it. There are very clear primary records of it. So are we right to assume that this is a very clear case, that we will be spared another round of debate like we've had about Ayodhya?
Well, I'd like to begin by saying I'm delighted to have this conversation with you. I think this is the first time that we are actually having a conversation, and it's such an honor to be having this conversation with you who have spent your lifetime, on writing about the Hindu causes. You talked about Mathura. It's an open and shut case, but it's very different from Ayodhya, which many people thought was also an open and shut case. You see, in Mathura, the evidence of a Hindu temple at that site is actually going back 2000 years. So in Ayodhya, the Hindu case, the evidence, the conclusive evidence was provided by the excavations conducted by the Archaeological Survey of India. Those excavations showed continued occupation of that site from the 2nd millennium BC. All right. In Mathura, it's very surprising and astonishing, at least for a person like me when I started studying this, that the first evidence of a temple at Mathura is an epigraph, an inscription which is dated before 15 Common Era. And why do I say 15 Common Era? Because that inscription says that it is being inscribed during the reign of a particular ruler whose reign ends in 15 Common Era. So when we talk about the evidence at Mathura, we have to also keep in mind that Mathura, you've talked about Ghazni and Aurangzeb, there was Sikandar Lodhi, so many others in between. And the last devastation is something that we don't remember or have forgotten, and that is by Ahmad Shah Abdali, who, the kind of havoc that he wreaked at Mathura. And the interesting thing is that one of his camp followers, who was part of his army, he was witness to all this, and he actually wrote a detailed account of Ahmad Shah Abdali at Mathura. You know, the number of people he killed, the cows he slaughtered, the children who were massacred. It's a gory account, and it is written by a camp follower. So nobody can deny that this happened. And this account was translated into English by the ICS officer William Irwin in 1911. So all the evidence that we have at Mathura dates well before the arrival of so-called Hindutva historians. Because all this evidence has been unearthed by Alexander Cunningham and people at the Archaeological Survey of India in colonial times, and thereafter by ICS officers like William Irwin, who translated this account by a camp follower of Ahmad Shah Abdali. Now, what do these accounts tell us? I want to cut the long story short, but for the benefit of the viewers, it's important to remember that no epigraph or inscription has survived intact. We are fortunate that only fragments have survived, or at least fragments have survived, and we don't know how many have got lost. But this first epigraph, it is by a person whose name is mentioned, Vasu. And he says he is erecting this structure, and he describes the structure. It has a toran, an arch, and it describes it's built around the quadrangle, and it says that it is being built in honor of Vasudeva. Now that name Vasudeva has survived, and it's not an accident that this inscription, which mentions some structure in honor of Vasudeva, has been found at a place we all know as Katra Keshavadeva. Now, those people who pronounce on the antiquity of Hindu claims to that site, they give this as the first proof of Hindu claims to that site, the antiquity of that place, because it's before 15 Common Era. And soon after this, it's called Vasu Door Jan. It's part of a door. And the surviving portion, which is only partly there, is 8.5 feet tall. So if that surviving part of the door jan is 8.5 feet tall, it's up to us to visualize how big the structure should have been or would have been. And the front part has a floral pattern, and at the back is the inscription. And you can find this in Mathura Museum. It is really worth going and seeing this inscription. It is, like Lord Krishna actually protecting his place. That is my place, and the inscription should have all disappeared except for this, which says it is for Vasudeva. It's, some of the ironies of history. And after that, I want to just complete this by saying that in 1911, an inscription was found in a well. Now, obviously, the well is no place for an inscription. So, obviously, the inscription flew there in the time of some attack. And again, a partial inscription has been found. But that is also absolutely breathtaking. It says that we are building a stone structure. It mentions that we are building a stone structure in honor of Panch Vrishni Veer, the 5 Vrishni Heroes. And we all know that Krishna belonged to the Vrishni clan, and the 5 were his close relatives: Sankarshan, his brother, Pradyumna, Anirudh, and Samba. So the inscription says that we are building a stone structure in honor of the 5 Vrishni heroes. It defies imagination how it could have happened this way. But Cunningham excavated a mound near this well, and from that mound, 3 statues were discovered. The statues were all headless. 2 were males and 1 was a female. And you must see those statues to appreciate the artistic talent of those people who carved those statues. The way the dhoti has been carved, the way the girdle has been carved. It's really magnificent, just as pieces of art. But I am saying this, that the leading art historians in India and abroad, they studied these 3 torsos, and they are unanimous. In fact, there is no dissenting opinion on this, that the 2 male torsos represent Vasudeva and his brother Sankarshan. And the 3rd statue, which is of a female, it's of a slightly later date, and that is their sister. It has an inscription at the pedestal. So, to find 2 inscriptions of so early in the Common Era, and to find these 3 statues, and there is no debate among the historians about who these figures are. When I look at this, when I read these, I come to the conclusion that there is something like a civilizational memory. It's not a very popular term, but when you see that devotee saying that this is the place devoted to Krishna, and you find these antiquities over there, you really bow before this memory of a people who were ravaged, brutalized, their civilizational symbols destroyed over and over again, but still retaining faith in their gods, and that faith actually being substantiated so much later by actual epigraphic evidence.
Yeah, impressive. I mean, there's a lot more to the story than only the story of iconoclasm.
Yes.
Clearly, it goes back very far. There's a lot to it. However, let's concentrate for now on that what makes Mathura interesting, or at least that what brings it into the news, is the story of its iconoclasm. So apart from Aurangzeb and Mahmud Ghaznavi, there were several others. So it was a very important place because people cared about destroying it.
Yes. Yes.
Now, according to Jawaharlal Nehru, this only proves that they were interested in building. You see, this is what he writes. Building interested Mahmud Ghaznavi because he praised the site. You see, regardless of the context, which is that he gave a speech before destroying it, saying, oh, this is an enormous place, you see. The angels must have worked on it for years, it's so great. And then he gives the order to destroy it. That is left out in Nehru's account. But so, the truth is that, you see, this was absolutely an attractor for the attention of the iconoclasts. Well, in this case, I'd say that it is very clear, and we can't expect a repeat of the Ayodhya debate, can we?
No, I just want to say one thing. When you talked about Mahmud Ghaznavi,
Yeah.
and he described the grandeur of the temples,
Mhm.
that was his court historian, Qutbi, who accompanied him.
Yeah.
But afterwards, when Mathura was devoid of these grand temples, it went on attracting these
Yes.
invaders and rulers like Sikandar Lodhi,
Mhm.
like Aurangzeb, like Ahmad Shah Abdali. There were no grand temples. So there was, to say that Mahmud Ghaznavi described the beauty of those temples, that is to ignore, deliberately overlook the religious compulsions that drove Mahmud Ghaznavi to do what he did. Because after all, when Sikandar Lodhi destroyed, Aurangzeb destroyed, when Ahmad Shah Abdali destroyed, there were no grand temples there. There were just small little things. So, but that motive was the same.
Exactly.
And I think that as historians, when we discuss this, we should not overlook the, iconoclastic.
Yeah, that is of course one of the tricks used by the other side when they emphasize that there was a lot of riches present in temples, and that is what attracted them, not anything religious. Whereas in reality, of course, it was not so much a temple they wanted to destroy, that was secondary to the real motive, which was to destroy a religion.
Now I want to discuss the second part of your question. You asked me what is the comparison between Ayodhya and Mathura, and I presume you are referring to the Places of Worship Act of 1991. Because the Places of Worship Act of 1991 specifically excluded Ayodhya and said that the only exception to this act is Ayodhya, where a case is already going on, and no exception will be made to other places.
No, not even in places where there is much less historical debate than about Ayodhya.
Now, the thing is that in Mathura, this act, it has raised very interesting questions. Because the last person who visited Mathura was Alexander. I'm talking about a historical person, not talking about pilgrims and all that, but who has left an account. That was Alexander Cunningham. He made 4-5 trips to Mathura. All those reports have been published by the ASI. And the last report, he says that the masjid built by Aurangzeb is in a very, very bad condition. There are huge cracks on the walls and on the ceiling. It can collapse anytime. So it's an open area for investigation. So we have to remember that Cunningham says there are gaping holes in the wall and on the ceilings, and it should be investigated. That particular site should be investigated. Now, why is this account of Cunningham so important? Because that is the last eyewitness account that we have of the actual conditions on the ground. Now, the masjid that we see in Mathura has no huge cracks on the walls or on the ceilings. So, what is the difference between that masjid that Cunningham saw and the masjid that we see today? There lies the whole story about Mathura. You see, if I can just give you a little background.
Very interesting. Very
now,
novel also.
Yes, yeah. You see, the Marathas, after the Battle of Govardhan, they acquired control over the Agra Mathura region. You know, the Marathas were an expanding power in North India at that time. So when they acquired control over Agra Mathura, they declared this site as Nazul or government land. And when the Marathas came here, then the Muttavallis of the masjid, they left. And they said, you know, we will look for livelihood somewhere else. And they left. So that is on record. So that place is only left to the Hindus. And after, in 1803, the Marathas are replaced by the East India Company and they continue the British policy. In 1815, the East India Company auctions this entire land. And I want to clarify that when we talk of Mathura, we are talking about Katra Keshavadeva, and that site is 13.37 acres. When we are talking about this, we are talking about the entire 13.37 acres. It was never divided, partitioned or whatever. So this 13.37 acres, they hold a public auction and it is purchased by a banker of Banaras, Raja Patnimal. And that, he is entered as the new owner in the British Revenue and Judicial Records. And after him, his successors are duly entered as the owners. That land, 13.37 acres, is never divided or partitioned among the heirs. It remains as one entity. In 1944, the heirs of Raja Patnimal, they have a small loan of about 13,000 rupees, I think. They are not able to repay that loan. They tell Jugal Kishore Birla, a leading industrialist of India, that we will give you this 13.3 acres, you just pay back our loan. They are not wanting any money, but they are not able to pay back that loan. So Jugal Kishore Birla buys this 13.3 acres, and in 1951 he creates a trust, Shri Krishna Janmabhoomi Trust, and he transfers this land to them. The trust has only one mandate, to build a grand temple for Lord Krishna at what is believed to be his birthplace at Katra Keshavadeva. But for various reasons, you know, there's death of some members of the trust, etc. The trust doesn't get around to building the temple. Now, in 1968, something very extraordinary happens for which we have no explanation till now. That trust is superseded illegally by a new body called the Shri Krishna Janmabhoomi Seva Sangh.
Yeah, that is indeed one of the great surprises in your book.
Yeah. So who created this Seva Sangh? It was not. When was it created? Why was it created? It had no legal right to enter into any, negotiation for the Katra Keshavadeva. In any case, this Seva Sangh, in 1968, it transfers 3 acres of land of Katra Keshavadeva to the Idgah Party. And the present masjid is supposed to be built on those 3 acres, which Katra Keshavadeva Seva Sangh hands over to the Masjid party. Now many questions arise, but to answer your question, the most important point for our purposes is that this masjid is built after 1947. So the Places of Worship Act cannot apply to it, because according to the documents, this masjid was built after 1968. So if this masjid did not stand there in 1947, then obviously the Places of Worship Act doesn't apply to it. That's a very, very important point. And to go deeper into it, who created the Seva Sangh? Who authorized the Seva Sangh to surrender land? After all, Katra Keshavadeva had never been partitioned. So, who authorized this partition of the land? Now, why was it kept such a closely guarded secret, this agreement? And did nobody see the masjid being built? So, people, I'm not getting into the merits of this argument, but people who are trying to unravel the mystery, they say that at that time, the Congress government at the center had become a minority government. And it needed the support of other parties to stay in power at the center. So, two groups that were willing to extend support to it were the Communist Party and the Muslim League. So, we can understand developments in 1968, perhaps in the light of these political developments. And we know that soon after, the education ministry was handed over to the communists.
Yes.
So, that is not something that has been proven, but this is what people are trying to understand. Why was this? It's very difficult to imagine an agreement of such magnitude being executed in 1968 without the consent of the central government. It's very difficult to visualize that. The state government and the central government would have been involved. And it's a real astounding case that a party which had never lost a case in any British court from 1834, I would like to tell the viewers, from 1834 in the British period, the Masjid party had tried to present its case in the British courts. And it lost each and every case that it presented to the courts, and the British judges, they heard the arguments very carefully, and every time they said, you have no case, you are just trying to, they're trying to forge documents, as in Ayodhya they forged documents. They said this place is not called Katra Keshavadeva, it is called Katra Idgah. So the court said, please present us one document which mentions this as Katra Idgah. They were not able to present. So from 1834, even if you go by the sanctity of a judicial verdict, from 1834 the Masjid party lost every case. So in 1968, when it had won no case, why did it suddenly get victorious and get land and acquire this?
Yes, it fits the sellout policies of Indira Gandhi to the allies that she needed at the time.
As I said, this is the conjecture of some people who are trying to understand this, but it is undeniable that in 1968 an agreement was made, and if an agreement was made surrendering 3 acres of land, then that masjid would have been built on those 3 acres. It wouldn't have been built outside. So the present Idgah that is standing, was it built in 1968? And interestingly, when this controversy broke out last year, many of these TV journalists, they went to Mathura and they talked to many ordinary people, ordinary Muslims, and they all said, when the agreement has been reached in 1968, why are you trying to muddy the waters? That means everyone knew that an agreement had been made in 1968 and we should not rake up issues that were settled.
Right, so there is clearly more research to be done. I will not prejudge that, to let the chips fall where they may. But the historical background at any rate is extremely clear-cut, or is it not? Like, for instance, in the case of Ayodhya, ever more evidence came to light that confirmed what had been in fact the old consensus, namely that this mosque was built in forcible replacement of a temple. So, some eminent historians who saw which way the wind was blowing were trying to shift the focus of the debate. And for example, I can quote Romila Thapar on this. She said, but the real question is, but was Rama really born there? Now, personally, I think that is not the real question. Like, for example, In France, you have a site of pilgrimage, Lourdes, where supposedly the Virgin Mary has appeared. Now, the French governments have mostly been militantly secularist since then. And yet, you see, no questions asked. You see, if people believe that, we don't respect that belief. We think this belief is silly. We think it's ridiculous. But we respect those people. So if they want to go on pilgrimage there, we're going to facilitate this whole pilgrimage. So similarly, any secularist government could say, people are going on pilgrimage to Ayodhya, even under very adverse circumstances. At every moment when it was fully under Muslim control or partly or whatever, they kept going there as closely as possible. So, you see, for a secular government, that is really the question. Whether, you see, there is some religious belief behind it that is credible, that is historically justified or not, that's not the business of government. So, in the case of, if we play their game and say, no, the real issue is, was he really born there? Now, in the case of Mathura, do you know of any reason for doubting that Krishna was born there?
See, as a historian, I'm really not concerned about whether Krishna was born there or not. I'm concerned about the evidence which shows that there was a temple there. And the other thing and the evidence I've pointed out, the Vasudeva Krishna, the Mora well inscription, and so much other.
Yes.
So, in the case of Mathura, there has been no dispute that Krishna was born outside Mathura. Nobody has claimed that. Nobody has said he was born in Afghanistan or anything. And one more thing that I want to bring to the notice of the viewers, that about half a century ago, I think it was a Dutch scholar who tried to investigate when were plays, Leelas, on the life of Krishna staged in Mathura. And here also, there was a fragment of an inscription that he found, which talked about plays, a family of actors actually. It mentions a family of actors who were skilled in dance and singing. And it says that this family used to conduct plays on the life of Krishna. Now, this inscription is also 2000 years old. So, the evidence at Mathura, which is over 2000 years old, is too overwhelming to be ignored. This inscription about a family of actors who were skilled in singing and dancing and acting in plays on the life of Krishna. This is not something that is a figment of anyone's imagination. And this book by a reputed scholar was published more than 50 years ago. So, in the case of Ayodhya, the epigraphic evidence was not as convincing or as powerful as it was in the case of Mathura. Because there is the only epigraphic evidence that I know is the Vishnu Hari inscription, which fell when the Babri Masjid was demolished. But before that, we have hardly got any epigraphic inscription. And we have cases of the foreign travelers to Ayodhya writing about Hindus going to Ayodhya and worshipping at the place and their connection with Ram. But in Mathura, it is epigraphic evidence which mentions the name Vasudeva, which mentions the Sankarshan, which mentions the Vrishni Heroes, and this tablet which talks about plays on the life of Krishna. And then we talked about Mahmud Ghaznavi. Now, it is something it gives us an idea of how much evidence we have lost. 100 years after Mahmud Ghaznavi's destruction at Mathura, there was a small chieftain or feudal lord, whatever you want to call him. His name was Jhajja. Now, again, we do not know of Jhajja from any other source. If this inscription was not there, we would not even know that Jhajja existed. And that Jhajja, again, it's a partial inscription because nothing is full. He says that, I'm rebuilding the temple for Krishna. So that memory that there was a Krishna temple at that site, which was destroyed by Mahmud Ghaznavi, it is rebuilt by a small person, Jajja. And we don't know how many Jajjas kept that tradition of temples and rebuilding temples at those sites whom we don't even know of now. So this story of destruction, rebuilding, destruction, it is something that happens again and again, and it is documented in many sacred sites of Hinduism, not just Mathura.
Right, you have mentioned earlier this inscription that was found in a well in the water.
Yeah.
Is that a case of people trying to bring some kind of safety to their murtis? This we don't know.
We don't know, but anything is possible.
Yeah.
We do know in South India there are so many cases where people ran away with the murti, threw it in the water, buried it underground, ran away with it to the jungle. But the fact is that the inscription was found in a well, and there were 3 torsos that were found of this family in a mound near that well. So, whether those torsos that were found belonged to that stone structure that was being erected is difficult to say. But they were, those murtis or images are about 2000 years old. So this is, in Mathura, the evidence is too much to be ignored.
Now, in the case of Mathura or Ayodhya, we are dealing with the birthplace of people who, if they were ordinary human beings, at any rate, we know for sure that they were born somewhere.
They were revered. They were revered figures.
Yeah, okay, but you see, initially, in both epics, they appear as human beings with a human life story with parents and marriage and everything. And so for them, maybe we can argue about when or where they were born, but at least that they were born, that's a certainty. Now, here we have a third sacred place. So recently in Varanasi, there people found an object that looks like a Shiva Lingam. Is it too early to already speak out about that as a historian? Is this really a Shiva Lingam? Or any news about that? Because first there was the sensational finding, then some people on the Muslim side said, no, this is not Shiva Lingam. Hindus said, yes, it's a Shiva Lingam. Maybe this is just something that we don't know yet, or maybe it is.
Before we get into this controversy, because the findings of that survey have not been made public, but I would like to just mention the antiquity of Shiva's relationship with Kashi. That is, for example, reflected in the legend, story or belief of Devodasa and Kashi, and how Devodasa leaves Kashi for Shiva. Then we have that famous legend of the ascent of the Ganges related to Shiva, also associated with this region. And we have found, seals, terracotta seals in honor of Avmukteshwar, that is Shiva who never leaves Kashi. So we found these of a somewhat later date, and then of course we have a Gupta period, etc. Now, there is people who are coming to Kashi, travelers and all that, who have written about Kashi. For example, Yun Sang, he has come here and he talks about this. Peter Mundi came, he went to Kashi, and he's even in his book, he's even presented a drawing of a Shivling and people offering oblations to the Shivling. So there are many, many foreign travelers who come, who go to Kashi and write about it. This temple at Kashi, we know it was destroyed. And the interesting thing is that the role of a particular family in reconstructing this temple at Kashi. There were 6 Maharashtrian Brahmin families who in the medieval period migrated from the Deccan and came and settled in Banaras. They played a very, very important role in the revival, regeneration of Hinduism. And one of these families is the Bhaṭṭa family. Now, Nārāyaņa Bhaṭța, he was living in Banaras when the temple was not there, and he persuades Todarmal that we must rebuild this temple. And Todarmal, we know, was the revenue minister of Akbar, and Akbar was not as hostile as other political leaders before or even after. So this temple was built in the time of Akbar with the help of Nārāyaņa Bhaṭța and Todarmal. And Nārāyaņa Bhaṭța has written a book, Tristhali Setu. In that Tristhali Setu, he is telling the devotees that don't feel disheartened. If you come to Kashi and you find the link is not there, it is your dharma to keep the dharma of that place alive. It is your dharma to keep the dharma of that place alive, and in the absence of the link, you should visualize that the link is there and circumambulate around that place. That means that sacred site, don't surrender that site. And then, of course, he's party to rebuilding that temple, and that is also recorded. And it is so interesting that his grandson, Gāgā Bhaṭṭa, played such an important role in persuading Shivaji to get himself anointed as a Hindu king. And Gāgā Bhaṭṭa, he met Shivaji when Shivaji was, coming back from Agra. And he told Shivaji that it's very important for Hindutva Swarajya. These are his words. He says it's very important for Hindutva Swaraj that you deal with other reigning monarchs or kings as an equal. The thing is that you have not been coronated king. And he says, I will devise the procedure by which, because Shivaji was technically not a Kshatriya, so he says, I will devise the procedure by which you can be coronated king. And he devises that procedure and he goes to Raigad and he is there when Shivaji is being coronated. So, just look at, we are focusing only on Aurangzeb or whatever, but there are people who were ordinary people, how conscious they were of their heritage and the need to revive it and to preserve it. So this Gāgā Bhaṭṭa tells Shivaji and Shivaji agrees and he goes to Raigad and presides over the function of the coronation of Shivaji. These are absolutely, fantastic things. Then of course we know that Aurangzeb gave the orders for the demolition. Now, some people tried to say that actually there was no proof that Aurangzeb gave the orders. But the Masjid-e-Alamgiri gives the clear, or it reproduces the orders of Aurangzeb that it has to be destroyed, and then it reports that it is reported to His Majesty that the temple at Kashi has been destroyed. So these are things that cannot be wished away. But one thing that I want to bring to your notice is that, there was a very famous historian of Banaras, A.S. Altekar. You are well aware of his work. In 1937, Altekar, when he was professor at Banaras Hindu University, he wrote a brief history of Banaras. And in that, he has devoted one detailed chapter to Kashi Vishwanath. And he says that, he's saying, and he even deposed before the court in 1938 or 39, the Allahabad High Court. And in that book that he writes, and he's given evidence in court also, he says that, I have been to this masjid built by Aurangzeb so many times. And he says that, it was very calculatedly built on top of the Mandir and was built in such a way that the core of the Mandir, that becomes the core of the masjid. He could have built the masjid on top of the temple, but not appropriated the core. After all, you can use the whole structure of the temple. But he did not use the whole structure of the temple because his intention was to occupy that, heart of Hinduism. And these are not my words. This is the work of a very respected historian. And, he has produced in that book, pictures that he took of pillars of the temple absolutely intact below the masjid. And it is a real eye-opener that at that time the court, I think it was the Allahabad High Court, it called many leading citizens of the city to come and depose on this matter. And so many people like P. Saran, another historian, and so many respected people, they gave their testimony before the court. And they said, we used to go there very frequently because that place was never close to us. And the one thing that I learned from that book, we talk, the parties who have claimed right to that temple today, they say we want the right to worship our Gupt and non-Gupt deities. Matlab, those deities we can see and those we cannot see. And he explains that those deities that we cannot see are those that were destroyed by Aurangzeb. So, can you imagine that? We can be critics of our culture, of our civilization and talk about it in a very demeaning and derogatory manner. But this popular identification with the culture, these are not kings who were saying this. These are popular people, ordinary people. So, the pratyaksh and apratyaksh murtiyan. So, we want the right to worship those deities we can see and those we cannot see. Those we cannot see are those which have been destroyed.
Well, there are, of course, unseen murtis in a different sense.
Yes.
And in fact, the ordinary people of that area probably knew about them,
Yes.
probably had seen them. Only Aurangzeb wasn't seeing them, because they were built precisely, or they were installed in such a way that they remained hidden. I have last week been in Ayodhya, and so one of the streets leading up to the place that at the moment still is hidden from view because still under construction. But so one of the old streets there, actually each of the houses is a concealment of a temple that is in there.
Yes.
And so you see Hindus kept on, venerating this site even when there was no temple at the site.
Yes.
And so similarly in Kashi, you had a number of concealed little temples around the Kashi Vishwanath or around the mosque of Aurangzeb. But that I mentioned because it is also a bit controversial. There also I've recently visited. And so I've spoken to some people who were connected with these local temples, and they were dissatisfied that the present government was not paying enough respect to it, that they were really, putting this to the side and making it into a tourist plaza. Yeah. And so, I suppose there are arguments on both sides, but what do you think about it?
You see, the thing is that whether the root, that sacred root, has been tampered with or not, is not a question that any historian can answer, because it requires a lot of familiarity with the sacred texts, the mandalas, etc., which is not my domain. But I want to tell you that in the medieval period, this Panch Kroshi Yatra, that had been disrupted and stopped for a long time. And then when things became not so hostile, it was restarted. Now, it was restarted, but people were not sure what exactly was the route. So they started the yatra, but Bhartendu Harishchandra, that great literary, Hindu Renaissance man, if I can put it that way, he was with a group and they discovered that the yatra route had an error at one point. Because they went by the texts, they measured each place and they said at this point there is a deviation, there is an error, the route should not be this. So that land which was needed to rectify that error and to make sure that the Panchkroshi Yatra follows that sanctioned route belonged to the Raja of Banaras. So they petitioned him that this is your land, can we have it to correct this route? And he gives that land, and the Yatra is then on the right route. So, it is whether this present attempt that has been made destroys that route is difficult to say, but there was such an attempt in the past to recreate the Yatra. It was found that the route has been wrongly designed, and a correction was made by Pandits and specialists of the period.
Right.
We don't know. I cannot say whether it has been done or not, but there was a point in history when the route was incorrect and it was rectified. I want to add one thing about Ahilyabai. We do not realize what a debt we owe to that lady. She, and again, this civilizational consciousness, it seems to have percolated deep down. It's not just the rulers. This lady, she rebuilt 2 important temples besides the ghats and all that she did, Somnath and Kashi. And Kashi, the temple that she has built, the main space is occupied by the Idgah. This is in the side in a small by lane, and the actual temple is so tiny, so tiny, so tiny. And and in Somnath, she rebuilds the Somnath temple, again a small little temple, but she does not have the conviction or the courage or whatever. Courage is not the right word because she was rebuilding those temples. But she is so cautious that she does not put the ling on the ground floor. Because, we must not underestimate the havoc that iconoclasm played on our mind. So even when the Mughals were not a dominant power, she builds the Somnath temple, but she builds a basement and she puts the ling in the basement. So that if anyone attacks, they cannot immediately attack the ling. So when we discuss Kashi, Mathura, when we discuss Kashi, Mathura and all these places, we must place them in the proper context, and that is the civilizational trauma at your whole sacredness, your sacred sites, your sacred centers being ravaged and reduced to dust by people who were so hostile to your civilization. I think that modern historians have done a great disservice by overlooking, ignoring, ridiculing this Hindu experience of the medieval period.
Right. Now let's go to an earlier period of your career. One of your earliest books is about Hindu-Muslim interaction in the 18th, 19th century. If I were a secularist, I would quote from that how the Hindus, surprisingly, or at least some of them, were like Gandhians avant la lettre, speaking about religious toleration and coexistence and so on. But that's not the whole story. So your later books have become quite well known. This one, I think, hardly anyone knows. So maybe you could summarize that which really ought to be known by people.
Yes, you see, there was a dominant school of historiography, let me say 20 years ago. That was the dominant school after independence. And that dominant school came to the fore in the backdrop of partition of the country along religious lines. So that school of historiography, centered at Altekar and hemmed by Marxists in various other universities, they wanted the traumas of the medieval period to be brushed under the carpet. And the first person who did this was a historian named Muhammad Habib. Muhammad Habib wrote a book on Mahmud Ghaznavi. It's very interesting that he should choose to write a book on Mahmud Ghaznavi. And he said, and his objective was, he said that religion had no role to play in the activities of Mahmud Ghaznavi. He was motivated by the zeal of a robber. So, to so turn upside down the activities of Mahmud Ghaznavi and to say it was just the zeal of a robber. That is a gross distortion of facts. If Mahmud Ghaznavi was motivated by the zeal of a robber, what was Ahmad Shah motivated by? Ahmad Shah Abdali. There was no zeal of a robber at work there because there was no wealth in the temples. So, how do you explain the recurring attacks on temples throughout the medieval period? So, my attempt was to show that actually the evidence that is available flies in the face of Marxist attempts to reject the trauma of the Hindu community and what happened in the medieval period, and that sense that the Hindus were different from us persisted throughout the medieval period. However noble a ruler may have been, like if I give the example of Akbar. Akbar was the first person who made Persian the language of administration at all levels. That means even the village patwari had to learn Persian. And he revised the curriculum in the madrasas in such a way that Khatris and Kayals would enroll and learn Persian in quick numbers. Now, in the British period, so many people learned English to get jobs of clerks in the British administration. But the point is that nobody will reject the argument that the Indians made English their own language, in the sense that they put in so many of their own words in English. So, we call it English or whatever you want. Salman Rushdie wrote a book which has got so many Hindi words and Urdu words, Midnight Children. So, the point is that the English that we spoke in the colonial period and after was not Queen's English. So, it became sufficiently our own language. But Akbar was very careful that Persian should not imbibe any trace of the language of the subcontinent and the pronunciations of the people of the subcontinent. So he got 2 dictionaries made, and the objective was that if I'm not a Persian speaker, but I have to speak in Persian, if I'm in doubt about a word, then I have to consult that dictionary and not bring in my own word. So that was the extent of keeping a different identity. And Akbar, as I said, he was the best of the rulers. But even Man Singh was his close friend. And all the Rajput Mansabdars who were helping Akbar to remain in power, they understood that on no major highway, for example, or a road, can you build or should you build a temple. So the temples should always be where they are not visible. They can be either in temple towns like Varanasi, but in the cities and highways, they should be not visible. Man Singh, when he was governor of Rohtas, he brought a huge amount of land to build a grand temple. But then, this is a quotation mark, fear of the emperor. Fear of the emperor, who was his friend and childhood friend, made him reconsider. And on that land he bought for the temple, he built a huge mosque. And then he built the temple behind that mosque in a small. This was the pattern everywhere. I'll give you the example of Shah Jahanabad. Shah Jahanabad, opposite the Red Fort, where the emperor stayed with his entire retinue. Just opposite that was Chandni Chowk. Chandni Chowk was where the Hindu merchants stayed. Jewelers, all kinds of traders, etc. So whenever they were called, they would just cross the street and enter. When a survey was done in the 19th century of all the public buildings in Shah Jahanabad, Chandni Chowk and all that, you will be surprised to know that the people could find so many mosques, Jama Masjid, Fateh Masjid, all those mosques they could find, but they could not find a single temple. And they were very surprised. They said that the elite business community of the Hindus was living just across the fort and every day supplying the emperor with whatever the needs of the royalty were, whether it was jewelry, whether it was clothes, whatever it was. So how come then they never built a temple? Even in a place like Katra in Chandni Chowk was a predominantly Hindu-dominated area. It had 5-6 mosques but no temple. So then these people, they investigated the matter and they found that the Havelis of these Hindu merchants, they had high walls, and inside of the wall there were small alas, openings in the wall where they had kept their deities. So imagine there was a time when Hindus had big temples at that Qutub complex which were destroyed. And then when the British come, there's an opening on the wall, perhaps the size of this painting, and there they have kept there.
All right.
So, what my attempt in that book was to show that there was no Ganga Jamna Tehzeeb. The examples were very few and far between.
Sitaram Goel said Hindu society is an underground society, so that is effectively what you describe. Now I'd like to go for the final question to an even earlier stage in your career, probably the first time that you became a public historian, namely when you took an important role in the rewriting of the textbooks as ordered by the Human Resources Minister Murli Manohar Joshi under the government of Atal Bihari Vajpayee. So this we're speaking of about 2002, and so the different periods were covered by different historians. You had the good or bad luck of having to cover the most conflictual period between Hindus and Muslims. And you wrote about it, and enemy historians judged that you were the most fearsome of these Hindu-minded historians. And indeed, of some of the textbooks, they thought, well, you see, they're just not professional, they're just shoddy, they're not worth criticizing, they're just not good. And you see, this in 2006, there was a conference or a session in a conference in Leiden of the European Association of South Asian Studies, where all the historians who had studied the material were in agreement that, you see, most of these new textbooks under Murli Manohar Joshi were, could not stand up once they were challenged, except for the one by you. And so I don't know if you take it as a compliment that the enemy side judges you the most fearsome, but at any rate, they still tried all kinds of arguments against you. Like, for example, you apparently had covered yourself against a very predictable idea that, you only, base yourself on primary sources. You don't take into account, as a professional historian should, what has meanwhile been achieved by historians in the case of the communal issue in Indian history, mainly by their kind of historians. And so, in order to fend off that indictment, you apparently had quoted them wherever possible. And so then, of course, they tried to attack you from another side, namely that, but you see, this is an amateur job, you only quote second-hand sources.
So what I want to say
yes.
Is that all the references that I had consulted, all the books that I had consulted, I appended at the end of the textbook, which no one else had done. So that was a very comprehensive list. It included primary sources and secondary sources. And as far as secondary sources were concerned, I took up 2-3 issues which, according to me, were the key points of the medieval period. The first was the limited political participation. So the facts and figures I gave were facts and figures which the so-called left historians had painstakingly unearthed. Those facts and figures showed that political representation was a very elite affair. It was denied in the Sultanate period to almost everybody except the Turkic ruling class. And in the Mughal period, Akbar, because of the political compulsions that he faced, that he was always facing revolts, he brought in 2 groups whom he knew would never revolt against him. One was the Rajputs and the other was the Indian Muslims. So this first point that I would like to emphasize is the limited nature of the political class throughout the medieval period. And you would think that this obsession with foreign origin noblemen would end with the death of Aurangzeb. But no, after the death of Aurangzeb, governors had to be appointed in 3 provinces, 3 important provinces. One is Awadh, which we can call UP today. One is Bengal and the other is Hyderabad. So each place, no Indian Muslim was even appointed. In Awadh, the important state of Awadh, the person who was appointed governor came from Iran to India, I think in 1709. And in 1722, he was entrusted the state of Awadh. So how can we brush aside these facts? The person who was appointed in Hyderabad, his family had come in the time of Shah Jahan, and they said, we are descendants of the second caliph. And the person who was appointed in Bihar, Bengal, he was a Brahmin who, as a boy, he was an orphan, I think. He was adopted by an Iranian and converted, of course. The Iranian served under Aurangzeb for as many posts as he could. Then he went back to his native land and took this boy back with him. When that Iranian died, then this grown-up man came back and he was appointed governor of Bengal. So he was rooted in the Persian tradition. So none of these 3 important posts was any even native appointed. It's all foreign-born Muslims. That should tell us something about the medieval setup. There is no point in glossing over these things. It's not the job of historians to gloss over. So leaving this aside, second point was the economic exploitation of the people of this country. People of this country means largely the peasantry. That economic exploitation has been recorded by all the foreign visitors to India in the medieval period. Because after Vasco da Gama discovered the new route to India and the various East India companies had been formed, so many people came to India as traders or as visitors. And they all write about the wretched state of the peasantry and how the peasantry is all the time trying to flee the land and the government officers are bringing them back. Why were they trying to flee the land? Because according to these accounts and even according to Mughal revenue accounts, the peasant had to pay virtually the entire produce. And they were left with barely subsistence. And this is a phenomena that begins, we get it recorded in the time of Barni in the Sultanate period, who says not a trace of gold or silver was left in the houses of these people, and their wives had to go and work in the house of Muslims as maids. But this thing continues throughout the Mughal period. And if you read Abul Fazl says there are so many tracts in this country where you cannot collect the revenue without sending the army. They are all the time rebelling. And this nature of the exploitative nature of the Mughal state has been so well documented by Professor Irfan Habib. I don't think it could have been documented better by anyone. Then, related to this, the entire economic surplus was taken away. It was shared among around only 1600 people. They were the elite. That is the royal family, the nobles, the governors, etc. So around 1600 people were distributed this entire surplus. And they spent 50% of that surplus on maintaining an army. Each Mansabdar had to maintain an army. And Akbar spent another 10% more. That means over 60% of the surplus was being spent on maintaining an army. At a time when there was no foreign invasion or threat of foreign invasion. So why was such an army needed? It was to keep the restive population under control. So this is the second point that I discussed. One is the political representation limited. The second is the economic exploitation. And the third is the cultural domination. I've already given the example of Persian, and I've already given you the example of temples. That the sacred spaces of any other community have to be not visible. You can have it in the alleys, by-lanes, or in your temple towns, but it cannot be in the highway. It should be away from public. So these are I'll be happy if I'm proved wrong, if counter arguments and counter facts are presented, because history is always a learning experience. There is no final word. So if evidence is presented which counters these views, I'll be happy to learn.
Right. Now, since then, indeed, that counter-argumentation has not been forthcoming. You yourself have, grown in stature, in the sense that in about 2017, you were entrusted the care of the research projects of the Indian Council of Historical Research, as I remember, because I myself have been a speaker at one of the conferences Irrefutable organized together with Michel Danino and with Sharalinda Mukherjee. So at that time, you see, some sympathizers might have thought, oh, now finally the Narendra Modi government is going to redo, but this time better, more professionally, what Murli Manohar Joshi had attempted. Now we're going to get new textbooks with a new perspective on history. Indeed, that is what all outsiders say. They say, oh, the BJP is a fanatically Hindu party and they want to manipulate history and they're rewriting the textbooks. This is a classic. I mean, as long as I've been studying this, I've heard this all the time. Now, you were there. Did you have the power to actually, redesign that perspective, or is anything ever since going in that direction?
If you're talking about ICHR,
yes,
I was a member of the council along with people like Michel Danino.
Yes.
The council, it has a very limited power to finance. We are actually a dispensing agency that we allot funds to people who present their proposals. So we cannot present proposals on behalf of the people. Among the proposals that come to us for funding, we choose the best. That conference that you mentioned was a conference that we initiated and we organized that conference. We invited people and it was a very good conference. Yes. Now, textbooks is a separate topic. I have no idea what is being done. I know that the curriculum framework has been designed, but I was not part of the process in any way. I don't know if the textbooks, the rewriting of textbooks has begun. Who's doing it? Certainly, I am not in it.
Thanks a lot. Okay, we're missing you, so you have your work cut out for you. Ladies and gentlemen, this was a very interesting conversation. I am glad you were part of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.